This is James Lancia, retired cop and author of the book Downtown White Police. What if I told you there was a particular race that was being targeted for extermination? Would that get your attention? What if I told you this race was a minority and the president was openly and publicly calling for the extermination of that race? Would that get your attention? What if I told you many of these people were reduced to squatters' camps where they were being starved? What if I told you this minority were unemployed and unemployable because the president made it illegal to hire any member of their race for work? What if I told you this race was being targeted for brutal murders, which include rape and torture in unimaginable ways? What if I told you that the young children of that race were being taken and sold into sex slavery? Would any of this get your attention? It should outrage any normal human being of any race. What if I told you the people I am speaking of are the white minority of South Africa? Did I lose your attention now because they are white? If I did, shame on you. This is all happening right now under our noses. Since the end of apartheid, which the world was in an uproar about and could not tolerate any longer, more than 80,000 white South Africans have been brutally killed by the genocidal maniacs who have been given permission and encouraged by their president to do so. They sing songs about killing the farmer, killing the Boer. The Boer is the name for the South African who has been in the country for 400 years. They worked hard and made that part of Africa beautiful and prosperous. The current fool of a president and profound anti-white communist Jacob Zuma has targeted whites there for genocide as an excuse for his failure as a president and as a leader of a nation that has fallen into a bottomless pit of unemployment, xenophobia, and violent crime. The world's precious Nelson Mandela, the ex-terrorist, also sang anti-white, genocide-inciting songs, while fleecing the world into believing he was for equality and healing a racial divide. This is also happening in other African countries, such as Zimbabwe, whose buffoon of a president, Mugabe, will not allow whites to own land and is as communist and as anti-white as they come. He also condones the murder of his country's white citizens. They all use the excuse for their hatred of whites by premising it on past supposed oppression by whites. Does this sound familiar to you as a white American? Jacob Zuma and the ANC has imposed even stricter gun laws and gun confiscations on the law-abiding in South Africa. They disbanded commando units, the equivalent of American militia, and left the people vulnerable to the murdering hordes who attack them constantly. Does this sound familiar to you as an American? Do you think this is something that could never happen to us here? Recent legislation, executive orders, and anti-gun rhetoric are aiming for the same thing here, rendering the law-abiding citizens helpless to the millions of anti-white, violent criminals. The recent appearance of UN vehicles and troops in South Africa are a concern among its citizens. What are they there for? Sound familiar? In September, Attorney General Loretta Lynch passed the Strong Cities Network, which will allow UN troops to police American streets. Do not think this can't happen to us. Since the end of apartheid, South Africa has become the murder and rape capital of the world. Remember, apartheid only meant the separation of the races in certain aspects. It was not oppression. What is happening now to whites is true oppression and true racism by the black-run government and the ANC. Even the average black South African is much worse off now than under apartheid. Even so, whites are 4 times more likely to be killed by blacks in this murder capital than blacks are. Angelina Jolie, the Goodwill Ambassador and Special Envoy for Refugee Issues, has been to South Africa just this past summer, and there was no mention from her whatsoever of the plight of the white South African. I guess goodwill does not extend to people of white skin, no matter how dire their circumstances. Not even a mention. Charlize Theron, a native South African, could do so much for her people just by making the world more aware of what is happening there. But she is silent, living a life of comfort while her people are murdered, raped, and tortured daily. Americans love to give charity to people of color. That's fine. But there is precious little done for these victims in South Africa because they are white. This is a portent of things to come. Look at Europe right now. Look at Australia, Canada, and the US. We are being flooded with violent people of color who complain that whites are oppressing them when they are the ones who are oppressing us in our own countries. The governments are all complicit in the destruction of these once great Christian nations. The governments lavish our taxpayer dollars on these invaders while holding back benefits from our veterans, elderly, and unemployed. Right now, whites are the minorities in major cities in the US and are suffering from brutal racial attacks and hate crimes committed by blacks and people of color in astronomically disparate numbers. Blacks alone commit 90% of all racially biased hate crimes. Remember this, whites are only 8% of the global population. Whites are the true minority and need protection. Why are we being forced to accept the invasion of black, Muslim, and people of color? Why is there such an urgent need to fill Western democracies with violent, hate-filled people of color? Why are we not accepting the true refugees, the white South Africans, who are dying at astronomical rates because they are a deliberate target for genocide? Would all the charitable funding and billions of U.S. taxpayer money that goes into Africa's anti-white countries, including South Africa and Zimbabwe, how much goes to these people who need it desperately? Obviously none. The so-called American president even visited South Africa recently and met with Jacob Zuma. He knows what is happening to whites there, and he condones it through his silence and inaction. Why are we not imposing sanctions on anti-white South Africa or Zimbabwe like we did during apartheid? Remember, apartheid never advocated for the killing of blacks. But under the black monster of a president who is there now, whites are being systematically raped, killed, and driven into poverty and starved openly with no care or concern of retribution or international backlash. Are whites being flooded into Africa, the Middle East? What about South America? Are they offering us what we freely give them? Are migrants and so-called refugees going into these countries? No. They are going to Western countries, given all types of benefits and still claiming that whites are racists. Whites will soon have nowhere to go to escape this hatred. If this does not sound suicidal, then you are beyond reasoning with. If it does, take my advice. Do not be afraid of the word racist. Remember this. If telling the truth makes you a racist, then I say embrace it. When you become a victim because of your white color, no one will care. Because even with all that we do for people of color, it is never enough. A black president, many elected officials of color, affirmative action, forced integrations, predominant demographic in major cities, HUD housing, government grants only for minorities, the list goes on. It is never enough, even here in our own United States. They will take, kill, and destroy until there is nothing left and no one else to blame. In my career as a police officer, I was a champion for the oppressed and for the innocent. I care about all human beings, especially those who are unheard, forgotten, or ignored when they are suffering and are violated. Let's take a lesson from the white South African.